Our next speaker is right behind me, Dr. Alice Julier, Associate Professor and Director of the Graduate Program for Food Studies at Chatham University. Please welcome Dr. Julier.
Thanks. I have teacher voice, but I'm going to use this. I'll be cognizant of time, I promise. Let me just make sure yep, good. Okay, so fun to go at the end, close to the end, especially because I'm a sociologist by training. I focus on some different areas than other folks have talked about. In particular, my vantage point is this nexus between the view of sustainable food systems with this focus on food production and agriculture, and the side of it that's food culture in particular, with a focus on historically situated cultural production. Like, how do we think about how we've been consuming food historically? And so today I thought I would focus a little bit on something we haven't talked about much, but is a major factor in our world, which is migration. And I want to say that migration it's a contemporary problem, but it's always been part of human experience, particularly in the consumption of food and animals, and how we need to consider that in looking at the future of food. So what I'm most interested in thinking about is also not to forget that as people move, they reshape culture. And as culture changes, food changes too. So people are often, when we talk about the migration of plants and people are most familiar with what Alfred Crosby called in the 1960s the Columbian Exchange, right? Raise your hand if you heard that in school. No. Okay. The Columbian Exchange is this movement of people, plants, animals, and germs. It's good to be a historian sometimes. Across the Atlantic in both directions, right? This reshaped the ecologies of the known world. So things like horses came to this end of the world and tomatoes came to the other side of the world. And later scholars like Judith Carney demonstrated that people, like the movement of people, specifically women who were forced to migrate due to enslavement, right, the transatlantic slave trade, brought not only seeds, but their agricultural knowledge to grow things like crops, and that knowledge and that practice reshaped the landscape of the South and the U.S., right? So we actually do know a lot about how those exchanges reconstructed landscapes to suit certain kinds of food production and reimagining entire cuisines. And in the world of sort of looking at migration and diversity and the environment, there are a lot of ongoing arguments about how to measure those changes. What are the impact of migration, particularly on biodiversity that these movements have caused? It's really hard to say whether it's completely worth it to say it's good or it's bad, right? It's too complex for such a simple dichotomy. And I think suffice to say, we want to talk about how human migration really entails a lot of complex skills of organization, cultural adaptation of people, and of different groups. And I think that's something we have to think about as we think about the future of food. So we tend to focus on this very Western perspective about migration, but there have been many, many migrations that have shaped the world. This map that I've got up here for you today is a chronological map of the dispersion of Austronesian people, right? So Australia and Micronesia across the Pacific. It's thousands of years. And what the map shows, you don't have to read the tiny little bits there, is that as people migrated to some of the more resource-poor islands in the region, they intentionally, obviously, transported plants and animal species that were crucial for their survival, okay, and also for cultural transmission. So certain animals, chickens, pigs, rats, dogs, plant species like bananas, breadfruit, taro, yam, paper mulberry, either domesticated or managed, were introduced over time from different sources and regions. And although each of these species have a different history, right, all these, I'm going to call them commensal species because you can eat them, were totally dependent on humans for this dispersal across these pieces of water, these bodies of water. And what I'm trying to get at with this is to talk about how these species' presence ended up being outside their quote-unquote natural range represents the legacy of those migrants. And I think that's important for us to think about, the ways in which the legacy of migration creates different kinds of food systems, right? And it gives us some really unique insights into sort of the future of human movement and cultural development. So the first point I want to make, and actually probably the main one I'm going to do in the short time we have, is that human cultures and their diversity and the biodiversity of plants and animals are linked in really important ways, and we have to think about them together. Okay, so despite this long history of mobility of people, human migration is currently at the center of major public debates about the globe. Right, you can't look at the news without coming across this. And so resources are seen as finite. Technology and global finance complicate movements towards equity across the globe. And political systems really veer into xenophobia. Migrants become framed as problems, not people. So think of the language of invaders and invasive species, right? But in contemporary times, people move because of conflict, violence, instability, geopolitical challenges, resource depletion, as we've talked about, and all those uncertainties. Food figures into this in major ways. 60% of the world's population is involved in agriculture in one form or another. So if roughly 1 billion people are sustaining themselves through agricultural work, and that doesn't include things like food production and retail food, right, the food service sector, then you have to think that that's a major piece of disruption when agriculture is undermined because of war and conflict. And people need access to food. We've talked about that a little bit today in multiple ways. As I've said, a lot of the focus on the question of human migration really focuses on the degradation of the environment that happens when people move around, right? You have more urbanization, more fragile nation states, global crime, specifically human trafficking, disrupted food systems. I said this was going to be the fun part of it, right? Sorry. But I think that there are some underlying questions there about like whether or not it's ultimately necessarily negative, right? When we talk about the future, we have to think about, is this necessarily a negative happening? So as biodiversity and genetic resources become the focal point of major national and international debates revolving around control, access, erosion of critical resources, we have to not consider biological and cultural processes as a casualty, right, of geopolitical problems. We have to think about them, I think, in ways that allow us to think them as positive possibilities. Okay. I'm going to skip a little because I want to get to everything. But I think that biodiversity and genetic resources have to be placed into this larger context of their inextricable relationship to cultural diversity and to human views of nature, right? We construct the idea of what is natural and what is nature. And that also is connected to how we think about culture and what is culture. And that's my area of interest, right? So again, consider how contemporary rhetoric frames both people and plants as invasive when they move. And there's a particular irony to that, given that the vast majority of people who do the work of harvesting non-native crops, of consolidated agriculture, are themselves temporary. Okay, so for me, as a social scientist, as a starting point, this is sort of an interesting question to think about in terms of the future. So I thought I would give you one quick example of how we respond to this. How do we think about this in a global way? And I'm going to bring us back to the Pacific, to Micronesia, to an organization called Micronesia Challenge. They focus on ethnobotany, on the traditional knowledge of people, and teaching them how to use and manage plants in all aspects of their lives. They learn about the legends around the plants, and they seek to effectively protect island resources, helping develop natural resources that can be used in a sustainable manner. And it's unique to each island. So it's a program for the entire region, but it's unique to each space. So they have increased production and farming. They've encouraged that and supported it financially, and then created local markets, and local markets that also teach people how to use the food to kind of maintain and preserve knowledge around cultural cuisine. Okay, so the point for me is a lot of these programs like this one focus very heavily on conservation and heritage. And I think this is very significant and much needed. And it may well be that the only way to conserve cultural biodiversity in the field is to conserve cultural diversity among people, right? So we have to really unify biodiversity and cultural diversity and food and agriculture when we think about the future of food. My point is people also they have to care about the food that's quote unquote their own, but they have to care about the food that's not their own. They have to, a xenophobia in humans is equivalent to the same about plants and consumables. Okay? And so just a couple more minutes on culture. I'm doing all right? Yeah. Okay. So for me, one of the things that I think about a lot is the way, as a historian and a sociologist, is that heritage and culture are slices in time in the human social chronology. Culture is created dynamically and through contact, right? In other words, cuisines and culture develop not only because people live together in communities, but because they interact with other communities and they construct their traditions up and against others in comparison. Okay? When you view this process and you see the diversity of cultures being squashed by the same forces that are also limiting biodiversity in plants and animals, another view suggests that migration and mobility create multi-stranded and diverse societies where differences can coexist or inform new cultural forms. So, look at diversity through the lens of culture, of cuisine. The typical cuisine is always the result of an evolution based on contributions of the different peoples who have passed through that place in question. So very few people raised their hand about the Columbian Exchange. Without the Columbian Exchange, those tomatoes that inform all the cuisines that we think of as the Mediterranean diet would never have gone there, right? And the products today that are considered essential in various cuisines are in fact borrowed from other lands that have been assimilated with the passage of time, right? This process is inevitable and enriching, and it continues today thanks to migration movements, to immigrants who travel with their culinary practices and habits, who acquire new food customs that they adapt as they adapt naturally to their new life and occasionally import to their new country, okay? I think that this process, we have to see it as helping to create adaptive and healthy food systems that account for the movement of human culture as much as for plants and animals. And so while I think there's one part of it that's about the preservation of culture, right, in particular around culinary cultures, there's another part about creating an engagement with newer cultures and newer culinary cultures. I think this is why agrotourism is such an important but deeply problematic way of thinking about this, right? In other words, you want to encourage people to encounter and engage with culinary cultures, foods, plants, and cuisines of folks other than their own, but you also want to do it in a way that's environmentally respectful. So this is going to seem like an odd place to end because I'm going to end with encouraging you to watch television. My suggestion for the future of food is to participate in a world of culinary and agricultural biodiversity in whatever form one can do it. And I want to also say that I write a lot about the question of cultural appropriation. And my suggestion about, is this cultural appropriation if you're eating the foods of other people? And my argument is that it's only appropriation if the group whose cultural practices who are being showcased don't benefit financially, socially, culturally from that. So eat at immigrant businesses, right? I think while travel and tourism have these ecological and economic limits, engaging with diverse populations nearby, encouraging migration, supporting localized diversity in food production, and respectfully learning about different food cultures are a really important way for us to do this as we move forward in the future. There are also 3 fantastic, if you don't want to get up off your couch right away, there are 3 fantastic series that I think do an incredible job of cultivating the biodiverse realm of people and food. One is the one I've got up here, which is The Migrant Kitchen. I think there's 3 seasons now. You can watch it on Netflix. It was from California. And it focuses specifically on Los Angeles and how the different culinary cultures that mix and thrive there have revitalized the city in unexpected ways. The second one is Samin Nosrat's series, Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat. Anybody watch this one yet? Yeah, see, there you go. I highly recommend it. She travels to 4 different places to explore how these key ingredients shape culinary lives and cultures and how those connect to foods and agriculture of the region in question. I particularly like this one because she is not your normal narrator for these kinds of shows. And she's Iranian, she's heavyset, she's a woman, and she can cook. So the third one is David Chang's Ugly Delicious, which I think is more uneven than the others, but for a fast view of how the food system works and how a food item can have a culinary impact all across the globe, just watch the chicken episode. It's on fried chicken. It'll teach you everything you need to know. So that is my statement about this, and thank you for having me here today.